work?
Well, we are live. You have joined us for another episode of The VUU. Welcome to those of you watching at YouTube. Today we have special guest Reverend Mark Belletini, the senior minister in Columbus, Ohio, who will be talking to us about his new book, Nothing Gold Can Stay. It's probably backwards in the camera, but anyway.
No, it is. No, it's fine.
Is it fine? Oh, good. Isn't that a beautiful cover? I think it's lovely.
It's good.
Meditations on the colors of grief. And meanwhile, let's have the regulars introduce yourself and say where you are.
Hi, I'm Joanna Fontaine Crawford, and I am in uncharacteristically frigid Austin, Texas.
What does frigid mean in Austin, Texas?
29 degrees, but yeah, it was iced over this morning, and so they actually canceled all the schools. I haven't killed anyone yet, which I think is a mark of my fine character. But I will tell you, after only 2 hours, I have a new sympathy for those of you who have had children home for days or weeks at a time.
Yeah. That would bring us to Hank first, right there. Hank, how many snow days have you guys had?
I think 7 or 8.
Wow.
So there might be a Saturday morning's school to make up and a week or something like that. So kids are not happy, as you can well imagine. But I'm speaking today from my lovely office here in Milton, Massachusetts, at the First Parish, and life is good. It's gray. It's going to snow in a few minutes, but we're like 2 inches away from like setting the record. And at this point, you want to go like, we might as well just set the record. Let's just set the amount of snow record and be done with it. And
now, what would the record be? How many inches would that be?
107. I think 107 inches.
Wow.
And the biggest thing is that it was set about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, but it would snow and then it would warm up and melt and then snow again. But here it's just kind of piled up. And let me just say, drove past the town hall. The solar panels in the town hall got ripped down with the ice dams. Everybody's church. Your parking lot's all filled up. We're spending all kinds of money. It's a grind. And for those of you who don't have to deal with snow removal in your church budget, like, you are so lucky. So lucky.
So what do you spend? Like hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands?
Thousands. I think by the end of the year it'll be like 14,000.
Holy cow! That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Wow. Isha, how about you? You're having gorgeous sunny weather out there.
Yes, the daffodils and crocuses are out. It's going to be unseasonably warm today.
Is it crocuses or croci?
Maybe croci. I don't know. So here.
Isha, you just went mute. What happened?
Oh, hello?
Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I'm doing well. Great weather.
Fabulous. Well, we have two of our folks on the way to Selma today, Patrice Curtis and Tom Shade. Tom's driving. I'm not sure about Patrice. She may be on a bus. I know a lot of... Oh, no, she's on the train. The Amtrak is running from D.C. down. Tons of people are on it. So, anybody from your congregations going to Selma?
Yeah, we have a couple going. They're taking our banner, and I'm really happy that some people are able to go. We've been talking about it a lot at the Columbus Church, and we're during one of the big snow days. Eric and I had scheduled a conversation around the movie Selma, and we had done this around 12 Years a Slave the year before, expecting no more than maybe 6 or 7 people to show up, and 33 people showed up. And the conversation was so extraordinary that Eric and I thought it was the best single thing that happened last year in the whole congregation. Everyone, the people who tend to talk a lot talked very little. They held back, and the people who are usually quiet stepped forward. Everyone had something to say, and we didn't have to say to anybody use I statements because they all did. It was just
And how about amazing. Did you get the same kind of turnout?
Well, we were we scheduled something, and it started to snow, that kind of icy snow, like at 32 Fahrenheit, and the roads were terrible. So we canceled it, and 10 people showed up anyway. And so we had it, but we're going to do it again for a larger group. And the conversation again that we had with those 10 people was extraordinary. So I don't know.
We're going to do an online conversation about the movie Selma for CLF folks, because it's for those of us who saw it. It's just both of those really well done movies that kind of there. And Aisha, now you wrote a blog about it for the VUU World, which is now in print. I'd read it online, and now you're in print.
Yeah, it was. I was not expecting to write that about what it meant to be an ally, but I think because I went to see it, I actually saw it the day before it opened. There's a small independent theater here in Seattle, not far from my home, and I walked in and half the seats were reserved for, or a third of the seats for the Seattle Seattle Association of Black Journalists. And I got very excited because I thought, okay, I'm going to go out with them after and talk about Selma. And after watching the movie and being so emotional about it, I just realized that was not my place to do so. I mean, I'm an immigrant. I don't have that lineage. So I had to step back, and I didn't expect that. I thought, I didn't know what to expect, but it was very emotional. You know what I wanted to say is I'm doing a multi-generational event at my church with the movie Dear White People. I was actually just as disappointed the Oscars ignored that movie because I thought it was pretty compelling and interesting. But I have a youth co-facilitating with me, and we're going to do that at the end of April. We're going to see the movie Dear White People and talk about it as a group.
Interesting. I saw that with Gia, my 18-year-old, who's Chinese American, and I thought it was really good, and Gia hated it. And it was so we had a really conversation about it. Yeah, Gia was looking for something for people of color, and Gia felt like it was made for white people, and I was like, well, all dear white people, you know. But so I'll be really curious to hear how your conversation goes.
Yeah, because my son, also a teenager who went with me. We had also an interesting conversation about it. So, and he didn't hate it. He actually thought it was a documentary. He wanted to know where that school is. I said,
that school is everywhere, dear.
It was real.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah. So
it's everywhere, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is as an interim, I was trying to look up the history of this church, and it's did folks from this church go down to Selma? And it turns out that their student minister went down to Selma 50 years ago. But I was looking online, and I found there's I'm sure I could find it again, but there's a website that lists all of the churches, all of the Unitarian Universalist churches that had sent members or ministers went down, and along with that also were lists of churches. I mean, there are obviously many churches who didn't send anybody, and there's no record of that, or at least there was no written record of that. But there were others, churches where the discussion was, this discussion came up and it was voted down in a congregational meeting, and I think it was as controversial there also among Unitarian Universalist congregations as it was in many other congregations. And it's the thing for me watching all of our colleagues heading down is that I hope folks, it's really easy for it to become a like a reenactment, like a historical reenactment, and I'm always very cautious.
But a glorified one where we all were in support of it, right?
Exactly. Right. We're all the winners,
Like all our people are supporting Black Lives Matter right now.
Right. And I want folks, I hope, and I think, I trust and pray that our colleagues understand this, and if they don't understand this yet, that when they get down there, they realize, like, oh, this isn't just for Unitarian Universalists. This is for everybody. This is an ongoing issue. This is hopefully a way for us to remind all of us that this issue continues on. That, like, we didn't solve it.
That's what I'll be really curious. our membership and fundraising director, Lena Gardner, is on the way down, or she's there actually, and she is one of the leaders here of Black Lives Matter, and a number of the Black Lives Matter young people from here are going down. Most of them are not Unitarian Universalists. But I know that Unity Church in St. Paul is taking along a huge cadre of people from the community, including the police chief. So they are really taking this as an opportunity to move forward now. I don't know how it's, I'm going to be really curious. So you know that there are streamed events that we can watch. The Moral Monday minister is going to do one of the streamed events. If you go to Living Legacy Project, there are 3 major streamed events on Friday and Saturday that I plan to stop in and watch. And I'm excited too, and I'm really curious. And what I keep saying to the people who are going is, I'll be really curious if the UUs are just off in a corner, because I hate to say how many Unitarian Universalists I have said, did you see the movie Selma? And the one comment they make is, it's too bad they called James Reeb a priest. And I'm like, seriously, you watched that whole movie, that whole history, and the only thing that you have to say about it is that they misidentified the religious title for a minister. I mean, it's not our story. We were not the center of that story. So I'm going to be really curious to see how these events, as you said, Hank, dovetail with the community's events. Aisha, you were saying some of your beloved companies.
We have one. Our co-facilitator, Rhonda Brown, who's an African-American woman, and her husband, she was waitlisted for all the UU events and got in last week. So she is going down with her husband. And she had an interesting take on the movie Selma. She hasn't seen it yet because the lead, I forget his name, he's not American. And so she said, there's so many African-American actors who don't get work, and it's hard for them to get work outside of characters being criminals or rap musicians, that it was a missed opportunity. However, I told her, I think he did a great job. And she had an interesting take on it, but she was very excited to get in. So it will be interesting to see what happens with hundreds of UUs and thousands of everyone else.
Yeah, and I also hope it doesn't become something of Northerners going down to gloat about racism in the South. It's also
nobody from Minnesota is going to be gloating about anything. I'll tell you that.
I mean, it's the 50th anniversary of Selma, but it's also the 40th anniversary of the busing riots here in Boston. And actually some colleagues and I were looking up last night. Actually, Bob West called on Unitarian Universalists 40 years ago to come on up to Boston. We're having to do teach-ins and protests about this. You don't hear a lot of talk about that. In some ways, it was too close. Like, people could come to your house, who were against, busing and throw bricks through your windows, and so it's a lot easier to, fly down to march and then to, take off. I mean, obviously, not all UUs did this, all these sort of things, but for it to happen here and happen in places all across our country, it is one of those things that kind of go, let's not get all psyched about Selma when there are plenty of other problems, and obviously continue to be problems too.
Right.
Hank, you were the person who emailed me a link to where I could get some of the Black Lives Matter pins. I did, passed them out. We had our meeting to talk about what that was like wearing those this past Sunday. Has your church done that yet?
No, just because of snow days.
Yeah, that's true. Where would you wear it? But from your living room to your dining room. Yeah,
exactly. So they're sitting on here. They are sitting on my desk here, and it'll be, I think, in 2 weeks that I'll hand them out next week, and then we'll talk about it the week after. But yeah.
It was a very interesting experience for the folks at Live Oak, and I think that one of the big ahas, it was a white woman who wore it, and she said she was all prepared, with her argument. If someone was going to say, "Oh, but all lives matter," any of that, she was all prepared. She said, no one said a word. In fact, they would avert their eyes, and it was all about ignoring me. And that in itself was a pretty deep lesson.
Wow.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. I think that's a great thing going on. Kenny Wiley has an article in the World about signage and all of that. Do all of your churches have signs up?
Have what?
Black Lives Matter signs up? Public signs? No?
No,
In Arlington, Massachusetts, they have the big Black Lives Matter banner, but the snow has come up so much so it just says Black Lives.
And then a big white. Black Lives, white it out. Huh. So, Mark, you look surprised by that question. You haven't thought about it? Do you not do signage at all there?
No, I mean, I preach about this stuff all the time, but we don't put up signs outside. We don't. It's not something that we've ever done because of where we're located.
That's
Very
kind of in the middle of a parking lot there. Yeah.
And at night they're not visible. We have no lighting except on the sign for the church in the front. So it's just we put a rainbow flag out on Sunday morning and then take it in because it's daylight and people can see it. But it's not something that we've done. I do have an interesting story that has to deal with Selma in a kind of a funny way. The museum here, the art museum here, has a terrible European collection, but a very fine American collection. And the curator of the American collection called me up one day and she said, we'd like you to write a 2,000-word essay on a painting for our catalog. And I said, really? I mean, why are you asking me? And she said, well, people from your church say that you know a lot about art. And I said, well, I have a degree in it, yeah. And she said, well, we want people who are not art historians to write for the catalog. And I said, okay, So I said, what painting do you want me to write about? And she says, it's a painting by George Tooker. And I said, oh, he's really one of my favorite American painters. And can I come in right now and see it? She says, sure. So I went down to the museum, and she takes me to this painting, and it's called Lunch. You can look it up later. It's called Lunch by George Tooker. It's a small painting. It's a bunch of people eating bread at what you're supposed to think of as lunch counters, but like tables. And there's all white people, one black person, and or possibly two. It's ambiguous. But there's 12 people in this room, and so I said, it's interesting. I need to know about it. She says, well, we have all kinds of materials from the artist and his partner. It was a gay couple. George Tooker was the artist, and then his partner was also an artist. And they went down to Selma, and they wrote about it. And we have all of their journals here at the museum. If you'd like to read them, that would help you to understand the painting, maybe. And I said, sure, that's great. So I get there, and I start, and he wrote very good. He had penmanship, and so I'm reading this, and it was so amazing. They were at the memorial service for James Reeb that King was preaching at, and Clark and Orloff were not there because they had to be whisked away for safety. And because the man who was writing this was an artist, he used painterly vocabulary. He was painting pictures. You could see what he was seeing. You could feel what he was feeling. He described the temperature of the air on his arm. He described what they were eating in the back room afterward. And all of a sudden, I realized that I had to make a copy of this and send it to Orloff and send it to Clark because this was something they had never seen. And it was the best description of that event and what the singing sounded like and how it was heard outside and how the sounds from the outside and the inside came in. It was so, so moving for me to read this. And then to reach out to Clark and Orloff, which they both enjoyed getting this thing. But it was like this unusual connection that came out of nowhere. And
That's interesting.
Yeah,
I mean,
So,
Mark Morrison Reed's book, I think the thing that I take the most out of it is just how relational every bit of what happened was and is, which is why it continues to be true to me that the most profound thing we can do is be in relationships with people. That it's always those direct asks that, that people say yes to. When I look at why so many UU clergy from here have gotten really engaged with Black Lives Matter, it's because of Lena Gardner being UU and Danny Givens being over at Unity Church. And when they ask, of course, and people know them, there's just that much more of a direct connection. So all of the churches that are doing anything to connect up and listen to the people in their communities, this is where those relationships really, really matter, I think.
right.
I always think of the day after September 11th when Bill Sinkford was in Washington, D.C. We already had a meeting scheduled with the American Muslim Council. We were already going to go over there. So that's what we did. And all their whole board couldn't get out. Nobody could leave. And so we spent the day with them. But we wouldn't have done that if it hadn't already been on the schedule, if we hadn't already been in relationship, if we'd suddenly gone, we want to be good allies, what should we do? So building those long-term relationships really matters. Well, anything else about Selma before we do a pretty major transition here? Joanna, I'll be curious to hear how the stories keep coming in there in Texas and how they're different in Massachusetts, and just
Right.
interesting. Aisha, you guys aren't doing that, or are you? Handing out buttons to people? Or
We're not doing the buttons. No, we are also, like Mark pointed out, we're not in a good place. I mean, we could put up banners, but no one other than the people coming, although that wouldn't be bad either to have them up. But we are doing a Selma commemoration Sunday night, and one of the things, we were watching some parts of Eyes on the Prize, and there's one clip that, if it's on YouTube, I would strongly recommend looking up this weekend. It's a clip of, I believe it's Jimmy Webb, who looks like a youth, trying to walk to the courthouse after Bloody Sunday. It might have been the same, after it all had happened, they were turned back, and he's stopped by white police officers, and the conversation is caught on tape, and he says to him at one point, he says, the white officer's saying to him, just go back to your church, go away. He said, okay, well, how about, I want to pray for you. He goes, don't pray for me, I don't want your prayers. And he invites him to pray with him. He said, why don't you pray with me? And he's being rebuffed but his point, I mean, it's astounding that in the face of such hatred, and he's saying, you're not equal to me, I don't want your prayers. And he said, well, if I have 25 cents and you have 25 cents, is my 25 cents less than yours? And the white cop is unrelenting in his hatred. It's a remarkable, and we're going to show it on Sunday. We're showing pieces of Eyes on the Prize, and yeah, it'll be, anyway.
So like excerpting different parts of it.
Yeah, with songs, and so it was I hadn't seen that, and it was pretty compelling.
Yeah, it's an amazing series. Henry Hampton, who worked at the UUA for a long time, was behind that. Yeah, I wanted to mention that last night I went and saw a movie about Grace Lee Boggs, who is a 99-year-old activist. Bless you, Mark. A 99-year-old activist who, Chinese American, but really, really active in the struggle for Black liberation. And it's an amazing, amazing documentary if you can see it. And just amazing person, but it just shows the the long history, and she's now in hospice care and needing money to help her. So this was a fundraiser. All the communities around the country are raising money for her, sending them in with this documentary. But I completely recommend it to people. It just was deeply thought-provoking and inspiring. It really, Mark, you're from Detroit, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So she starts out, she's with her walker, she's 99, she's next to this destroyed building, and she's saying, I wish everyone could live in Detroit, because you get to see what happens after the cities thrive, and they show this old footage of Detroit and how it is now, and it really takes you to this different place of looking at time and progress and all of that. Anyway, I couldn't recommend it more. I bought the DVD and plan to watch it again, so. So, anyway, there's lots of great stuff going on, that's for sure, including a new book by Mark Belletini, Nothing Gold Can Stay, The Colors of Grief. It's a Skinner House book. One of the lovely, it's not meditations as in short paragraph long pieces, but it's, I've read it and love it. It's kind of, Mark, you're really parsing grief in a way that's pretty unusual. So let me just start by saying what took you to writing a book about grief, particularly?
I was asked, actually. Skinner House, Mary called me up and she said, we would like you to write a book on grief. And this was, yeah, well, it was some years ago, and the book that I had done before of my meditations, if you will, that wasn't writing, that was simply gathering and arranging, which is a whole different part of the brain. You know, as senior minister of a very large church, I have to schedule time to sleep, you know, to sleep for 2 hours. I mean, it's a very rough thing to actually write a book. And so I said, no. I said, I can't do that now. I don't have time. And she said, and I quote, this moved me very much. She says, well, we'll wait until you're ready. And so after about a year, I said, oh, okay, you know.
Now, do you think it was, clearly you've spoken about grief, do you think it's partly, I was thinking, you're being Italian, I mean, some cultures really know how to work with grief a lot more than other cultures do.
I think it's because I'm known for talking about the number of people I'm buried. I mean, I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area during the AIDS years, and I buried everyone, and I was the one who did it. I was always the clergy, with one exception. When my best friend died, I went to the rabbi. But, and I had never had benefit of clergy before. So it was an interesting thing for me to watch the rabbi counsel us around grief and stuff like that. It was very moving for me. But I talk about this. I mean, this impacted my life so immensely. And I see everything through that lens. And you know, when my parents were in their 80s and all of their friends were dying, they sounded like me then. You know, when I was in my 40s,
yeah,
it was the same thing. So anyway, I sat down to write it, and it was an interesting experience for me. To relive all those things, because I told her when she said we want a book on grief, I said, well, I don't want to write a book on grief. I'm not a trained psychotherapist. I haven't, you know, gone to college courses in grief, if there are any. I don't want to parse it and make lists of the 5 things that happen or anything like that. And she said, we don't want that. We want stories. And I said, well, I can do that. I can do that.
You could do that. Yeah. I think of my grandmother who was burying all of her friends in her 80s and said, forget it, I'm sick of this. I'm going to start hanging out with healthy young men, and took up with a bunch of young gay men. And then, of course, as you say, she was like, what? This is just like, you know, she was like, clearly I made the wrong choice here. This is worse than the old people. It was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Aisha's lifting up the name of the book, Nothing Gold Can Stay, that beautiful Robert Frost poem. I told Mark, I started to cry because my mother asked for that poem at her memorial service.
Oh, wow.
And I had never particularly paid attention to it. I always thought the gold was fall. But it's talking about that color in spring, before the green, when it's just yellow and beautiful, and then it moves on, you know. Yeah. So the gardener, I love the poem. And you, Mark, you mentioned you hadn't really known the poem that much either before.
I hadn't known the poem, and I ran across it by accident, and immediately the title, which is also the last line, just grabbed me with its simplicity, memorability, and stuff like that. And I have to say that the cover that they produced for this was so beautiful. It was. It just grabbed me when they offered me a bunch of covers to look at, possible cover designs, and this one was really, you know, after I looked at it for a while, I just said it just draws me in, you know. So, yeah, the poetry, there's 4 poems in the book, and and that was an interesting process because one of the poets had died, Albert Hufstekler. He had died, and the press that had published his poems was defunct, and you still have to get permission. And so we had to do detective work And we worked on this for 6 months. The people at Skinner House and me, going online, going on to YouTube, looking to see if we could find out his daughters, when any of his daughters would give us permission. And of course, they all changed their name. They all got married and changed their name. So even finding out who his daughters were was, you know, it was real detective work. And finally, we couldn't get permission. We couldn't find the daughters, and the deadline was coming up. And it was an interesting thing. So I was asked to rewrite the last chapter, because that is involved in the text of the poem. And I said, okay, so I rewrote the whole last chapter, and on the day that it was supposed to go to press, Marshall called me up, and he said, well, we just got permission for the poem. We found one of his daughters in Scotland, and she gave us permission to use the poem. And but you know, there was like real tension as we approached the actual deadline for going to press, and it was also complicated just to get the permissions for the other poems. This was a whole new world.
Oh, yeah. Getting permissions for poems, we could have a whole. I mean, because for Quest, yeah, it's a big deal. Hey, we're halfway through our show. Let's take a minute and have people reintroduce themselves. This is Meg Riley here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're talking today with Reverend Mark Belletini in Columbus, Ohio, who's written a book called Nothing Gold Can Stay, The Colors of Grief.
Hi, I'm Joanna Fontaine Crawford. I'm in Austin, Texas.
I'm Aisha Hauser. I'm in Seattle, Washington.
Hank Purse, I'm speaking to you from Milton, Massachusetts.
And behind that chalice, we have Shauna Foster back visiting us, our former tech assistant on the show, so that's fun to have her, even if we can't see her. And just wanted to give a shout out to the viewers and to say that you can also follow this on Twitter, hashtag the VUU, VUU. So we're open for questions. And
I have one.
Good.
This is something I've thought a lot about. Mark, do you feel that right now our culture in the United States does grief well? And I'll admit, I think that we don't do grief well.
Okay. Well, one of the things I wrestled with in writing the book was the whole business of what does good grief look like? And what I came to eventually was people grieve in such different ways that, like for instance, my former partner in life, Phil Porter, who is responsible for Gathered Here and The Mystery of the Hour, and we have a fine relationship. But when a friend of ours died, Alex, he had told me earlier in our relationship that he never cried. He didn't cry. He just didn't. I said, for nothing? He said, no, I don't cry. I said, well, you grieve, don't you? And he said, yeah. He says, I sneeze. I said, you sneeze? You mean like achoo? And he said, yeah, I sneeze. I said, and I didn't get it. But so our friend Alex died, and I asked people to share stories and stuff like that. And he stood up and he started talking about his friendship with Alex, and all of a sudden he had a sneezing fit. And he had to sit down. He could not stop the sneezing. And I said, oh my God, he's grieving. He's crying in the way that he cries, which is not the way I cry or most other people that I know cry. But it made me realize that people grieve in the way that they grieve. And some people don't let go of grief, letting it flow as a process. And I have had people in my congregation. There was a woman in my congregation who lost 2 husbands in a relatively short time, and her grief was incredible. I mean, of course. I mean, they were out in Santa Monica on vacation, and she came in from the water swimming, and there was her husband on the blanket dead. It's horrible. It's a horrible experience. And she grieved, and she talked about it a lot. And some people in the congregation took it upon themselves to say to her, I think you grieved too long. And I took them aside and basically said, don't say that again in my presence. That is not your business to decide how long someone grieves, or what their grief looks like. So I think there's all kinds of grief, and I'm not sure I understand how. I can't put it easily into the categories good and bad. I've been all over the map, and I tried to show that in the book, that I've been all over the map with grief. Sometimes my grief doesn't look like what anyone thinks is grief. I mean, the thing that most hit me, I think, during all the years that I've grieved, was how grieving affected my focus. And I would go months after, like, my best friend died. I went months without focusing on anything for more than, I became like, what was it, ADHD. I became the poster child. I couldn't focus on anything. And it was grief. It was grief. And do I cry? Yeah, I cry in a kind of old-fashioned way. I throw myself to the floor and go into a fetal position. And Phil used to hold me excellently when I was doing this, when, like, my grandmother died and so forth. I really, he wasn't afraid of tears.
I think it's so helpful what you're saying, because I think, in a way, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote all of that to be very helpful, has given people, like, here's how it should be. And especially the people who aren't grieving but are watching other people grieve. So you're in denial now. Or you need to get out of denial and move on. I've seen that a lot, mostly not spoken, but you can feel it energetically. It's kind of like Joanna mentioned, the person averting their eyes. It's an energy of, here's how to grieve. And I was talking to someone recently who lost both of her parents within a week. Her mother died. That was very expected, and her father, I think, literally died of a broken heart, like, less than a week later. So she was just bereft. And she was saying to me, the worst thing about grief. Hey, Mark, can you mute? Because otherwise I'm getting an echo. There we go. She was saying the worst thing about grief, this is now a year later, and she's Jewish, and I was talking to her about how the Jewish traditions really are so supportive during that year and on. But she said, the thing about grief that I really hate, like, I've been a good sport about it, but now I'm ready for it to come back, okay? Like, I've been a good sport. She said it's the relentlessness of the absence that I can't stand. So we had that conversation, and then the next day I was peeling an apple at the sink, and all of a sudden, my mother died in 2002. All of a sudden, I'm just bawling for my mother, like, out of the blue, and I just cry and keep peeling the apple. By the time the apple's peeled, like, it's gone by. I'm not bawling anymore. I don't need to go cancel everything. And someone on Facebook said that's called a grief surge, and I thought that is what it was. It just surged up and went by, and it's so interesting to me now with both of my parents' deaths, especially, how things just come. I'll be at a stop sign, I'll see the pink rose, my mother loved them, I'll cry, the light will turn, and I'll just go on, so.
Right. Well, so this past Christmas, when we were watching It's a Wonderful Life, one of my daughters asked about, it's the scene after Jimmy Stewart's dad has died, and he's wearing a black armband. And so they wanted to know about that. And so, then we were able to talk about, okay, well, different cultures at different times have had kind of an outward sort of sign that you were in mourning. And I wish we still had that, at least for a certain amount of time, so that it could be, okay, this is why I'm acting so distracted, or this is why I'm suddenly bursting into tears.
Yeah, when my father died when I was 13, even though my parents had been divorced, so with Muslim funerals, they're very somber, and in fact we couldn't. I remember driving to his memorial, his funeral, and we weren't allowed to have music on the radio because you're not allowed to hear any kind of joyous music, and that goes on for at least a month. And for the widow, my parents were divorced, so she wasn't quite his widow, but in Egypt, they'll be in black for a year, to symbolize that the wife lost her husband, and sometimes mothers will be in black for the rest of their lives if they lost a child. So it's very communal, the grief and the mourning. But Meg, you brought up, what is it? The grief coming back. And my father, I was 13 when I lost my father. Yeah, and it'll still happen that every now and then. Now it's every few years that it'll happen, but something will trigger that I will just fall apart for. You actually put it really well. Just for a few minutes, I will completely lose it and then be okay. But it's like, and I also lost a sibling. I have a sister who died, and she's more, I think of her more when I'm around my mother, who will say to people, I have 3 daughters and one died, and she was an infant, so I don't have physical memory of my sister, but I have memory through my mother, which is interesting. So
I think in answer to your question also, Aisha, that the idea of not talking about grief, ordinarily when we're young, I remember when my cousin Linda died, I wasn't taken to the memorial service, or to the, not the memorial service, but the wake, what we used to call the wake in Detroit. She was 6 years old, when she died, and I was 6 years old, and I think it would be good to, and later I did see, dramatic grief, like when my grandfather threw himself on his dead brother's coffin, open coffin, at the funeral home, and telling him, should be me, not you. I mean, it was dramatic, and Italians sometimes do that. But it was never talked about. And I think just talking about the events of grief would make grief flow in all of its forms, maybe a little bit better. I think there's, we're educated in everything except emotions. We don't talk about them that much, as far as I can tell. So things like grief, which are a universal part of life, no one escapes that ever. That's where I think that we've made some mistakes. And one of the things I said in my book about the Jewish stuff is that it is quite magisterial. It really, the rituals were equal to the death of my best friend, and I'm very grateful for that. Carol Hepikowski and I have talked about this sometimes, about what would it be like to develop Unitarian Universalist rituals around grief beyond the memorial service, which she and I both think we do better than anybody. I think our memorial services are outstanding, and people always tell us that. When they come to one of our services, they're always amazed that we tell the truth and celebrate the fullness of the life in all of its complexity and so forth. I don't think we
great
talk.
retirement program for you. I hope you'll take that seriously. You're so good at developing ritual, and I envy my Jewish friends that structure. I haven't had the kind of sudden traumatic death, of an accident or something like that. But that's where I think that structure would be especially useful, because the people that I've, been with who have gone through that are just literally, it's as if, there's no ground under their feet. And I hope you and Carol, or you, will really take that seriously. I think, would be a great gift to us. I see Hank and Joanna ready.
Go ahead, Hank.
Well, as my mom is from Northern Ireland, and even though we're Protestants, there's still that sense of I grew up with a sense that, we always went to funerals, we always went to wakes. It was one of those things that that I've continued on with my own kids, like let's go see the body. And last year a friend died, and who had a daughter who's just a year older than my oldest daughter, and we were driving to the wake, and I was telling my girls what was going to happen, what we're going to see, that the body would be there in the coffin, and so we first went in, and my and the girls were a little like, oh, this is kind of weird, but then they saw their friend, and their friend totally needed, like,
Yeah.
her friends there, right? So they're all running around. It's great. You know, and they're off, and it was a big funeral home, so it was great. Lots of people there. And I knew it was time for me to leave when I looked over, and some other young friends, you know, who were like, you know, 10 or 11 had shown up, and I see my daughter bringing this other friend over to the coffin and doing sort of one of these, like, oh, and here's the body. I was like, okay, all right, time to go. But like, you know, I think for me, and I think it is that Irish sense of like, you're always around death. And my mother, you know, she talks about when her father died that his body was at the house in the front room, and my mom says, that's what we will do. You know, that's what you'll do with me. And you know, and I kind of go, right. And then people will come by, and we will be there and show people in and have little sandwiches to give people, and that, which I think just helps being part of that process. I think people are starting to be a bit better around death. I think for a long time people were like, the only people who die are people who live in the inner city or people who have moved to Florida, right? And I think being able to sort of say death is around us. This is part of what it is. I missed the funeral of a friend last week, but was able to go to the reception afterwards, which happened at a bar, and you know, and it really, like, you know, and here's all these like old punk rockers, and we've all just become sort of like, you know, 50-year-old, you know, Irish guys hanging around. People are having pints and talking and sharing stories and talking about his siblings and his kids, and you know, it was very it was heartwarming, and it was, you know, once again, like the true definition of bittersweet. Seeing friends who'd flown in from across the country, and yet something very different from you know, and sad that the reason why we came together.
You know, it seems like there are some changing attitudes about the care of the body that I've been seeing in the last 10 years. I mean, I remember for me when I read Kate Braystrip's first book, and she talked about her husband dying, and then about, you know, going to, I guess it was the crematorium, and washing the body and being there when that whole process happened. And that was the first time I had heard anything like that, and it just struck me at, wow, what a better way to kind of deal with this. I have a friend whose young daughter died of cancer, and when her body they were there when her body was cremated, and of course they were grieving, but to them the idea that those horrible tumors that had just kept growing and growing and couldn't be stopped, and that those were being incinerated into ashes, it was something very healing for them, you know, to be there. You know, it just seems like we're getting more in touch with those kind of things. You know, we're not. I have a friend who's a mortician who told me that the reason why they call them undertakers was because those were the people who undertook what the families didn't want to have to deal with. And you know, it seems like we're swinging back a little ways, you know, towards, okay, this isn't going to be something that, you know, the body's just whisked away, and then, you know, the next thing we know, we're handed a box of ashes, and we have no connection to anything that happened between those.
Yeah, I agree with you, Joanna. That was the best thing I did when my dad died, was I just did vigil while they burned his body at the crematorium, which took hours, but it felt great. And Mark, I would have loved to have a ritual, a UU-centered ritual. I mean, I did bring poetry and I meditated, but it was the best thing I did to bring closure, because I never saw my mother's body. I had just left. I got called when I'd driven 3 hours. I didn't turn around and drive back, and I never saw her body, and I really regret that. My siblings, when the funeral home was like, does anyone want to see the body? My siblings were like, no, and I was like, yeah, totally, I want to see the body of my dad. And my sister was horrified, but all my siblings ended up going, well, okay, let's see it. And then they were like, no, nobody wants to watch the cremation, right? I was like, yeah, totally. And my brother ended up coming with me, and it was just a wonderful thing. Aisha, I'm sorry, I think I butted in.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to point out that the we, because there's a lot of we going around, isn't everybody. I think it's a primarily European Protestant culture that separates so far, because when a Muslim person died, it's the family that does a ritual cleansing of the body, usually the men, but sometimes it can be the females. So it's not separated at all, and the body has to be in the ground in 24 hours in a white shroud. So it's I mean, I think other cultures are more connected to death in a different way than the white Protestant, which I think is what Unitarians hold on to, which hopefully Mark will change with his new book on rituals on grief after this one.
Well, one of the things I talk about in the book is exactly this business of the customs. Growing up in an Italian-American household, you know, there was no cremation. It was done, you know, it was a 3-day wake, and then there was the requiem, and then there was wearing black, my grandmother and so forth. And so there were some clear rituals that I probably thought were universal. I don't know. That's all I ever saw. And I remember the first time that I guess when my friend John Zamorowski died, he was cremated, and his mother had asked me to do the memorial service. And at the crematorium in San Francisco, which is a beautiful Gothic bullet-shaped building where we did the service, his mother had brought in the urn with the ashes and put it on the table with candles on either side and flowers. And it was something I had to learn how to deal with, because the last time I had seen John, he didn't fit into an urn. And so I cried. I just lost it. And I sent a message to the mother saying, we'll start the service when I'm good and ready to start it, because right now I cannot. The impact of that event was, it really worked with my grief very well, actually. But it was a new thing. But I often wanted to touch the bodies in California when people in my church died. I wanted to go into the morgue and see the body and lay my hand on it. And a lot of people thought I was very weird. And they said, no, that's disgusting. So why would you do something like that? And I said, it helps me with my grief to touch the coldness of the body. It did, you know, and it's less and less possible sometimes these days for me to do that, but because the bodies are sometimes whisked away so fast that, you know, I don't know. I don't even know how to ask where they are, and I'm dealing with the family. But I think the cultural differences are significant, and those need to be explored. Once on the fellowship committee, we asked questions about how do other people grieve. We were asking students questions like, what do you know if a person with a Jewish background in your church dies? What do you know about Kaddish? Or if a person with a Muslim background dies, do you have any idea what goes on? And it's not something that gets talked about very much, even in our schools. Those cultural differences about the rituals and approaches and psychological approaches, and and yeah, I think it's something to unwrap and unfold, especially when we talk about multicultural stuff. What does that actually mean? I read a passage a couple of weeks ago in church about a woman who wrote this thing about multiculturalism. She says, when people want to have a multicultural church, very often what they expect is for people of different cultures all to melt into the one white culture. And that's what multiculturalism means. It doesn't mean that you bring your great ritual of touching the body or wrapping it in white cloth or whatever. You don't bring that. You submit to the idea that, the body's taken away, and then we have a memorial service 2 weeks later, and so forth. And it's a lovely ritual. I have to say, like I said, our memorial services are extraordinary, and I always feel privileged. On Sunday I did a memorial service for a 29-year-old man who I didn't know, who had committed suicide. The whole time I was doing it, I felt like I was walking on sacred ground, because I was dealing with life and death, the mystery of life and death. It was powerful. It was very powerful. But there's other things, other rituals. I think,
Yeah, we had somebody on, was it just last week, talking about end-of-life choices. And it seems like the kind of grief that you have is really different when the person has, I was looking at this TED Talk, and it said something like 84% of people die in institutions, and nobody really wants to, and it was a doctor talking about how medicine needs healing, and I think some of that stuff can actually get in the way of the grief if you're dealing with all those systems at the end of a life, as opposed to hospice.
Yeah. It is different with the suicide, certainly, or car accident. There's that shock element that is beyond the regular colors of grief. That's a very, all of a sudden, bright color that people have to deal with. Just the kind of believing that the death actually happened. But I also recognized 2 people recently in my church self-delivered. They decided their time was over with, and their spouses were all for this, and it was a different kind of an experience. It was, yes, if you will, technically suicide, but it was embraced by the family, that it was time, and that was a whole different thing. It was a whole different way of the memorial service looked different because of that. So, and there's more and more people talking about this kind of thing.
Yeah. Moving away from human death, I have a congregate family last week. I didn't even know this was a possibility, and I thought this was so terrific. They have a family pet dog who predated, was older than their daughter, predated their marriage, and it was the dog's time to go. And apparently there are vets who will come to your house. Wow. So you don't have to take your animal in. They administer the shot there so the animal can die there. And then not only does it have its effect, on the family, that they can be there and feel like they're surrounding the dog in their home, but also animals grieve, and the animals can now come over, see the body, and that any of you, if you've ever had that experience of taking an animal away and, getting them put to sleep, and then the rest of the animals at home are like, what happened? Supposedly there's research on this, that this actually helps.
Yeah, we did that, and our second dog absolutely got it. It was just completely clear. Yeah. She came over, she smelled, she adored the older dog, but she got it. I mean, we all grieved, but I thought she would have just been constantly at the door without smelling and knowing and being informed. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing, and more common that they come to your house that way. Well, Mark, any last thoughts for us about the book? We have just a couple minutes left.
Well, Tom Owen Toll once said, I don't remember where he said it, but I'm sure he did. He once said, each and every day of our lives, 60% of it can be profitably spent in grieving. And I thought, when I first heard him say that, I remember thinking, this was during the AIDS time, I thought, well, maybe 80%. but certainly, grief comes up to me every single day. It does, even if someone hasn't died recently, even if I'm not particularly mourning for somebody, it's every single day. And certainly in our service on Sunday, we set time aside for people to lift up the names of those that are grieving for every Sunday, like Kaddish, and we remember people for other reasons too. And it's not, we're not always grieving. We're also loving, and we're contending, and missing, and all that other stuff. But we're also grieving every single day, and just knowing that that's life, that's the way it is, and learning to do it well, learning to face all of our emotional ups and downs, ins and outs, the messy as well as the graceful, is an extraordinary spiritual practice, it seems to me. So.
Well, thank you. Your gifts have certainly enriched our movement in many ways in this book and the one, as Aisha mentioned, that you'll be writing soon. That we're all looking forward to now.
Yeah. Well, we're looking, actually, a couple of us are looking at another book first that we're in a conversation with. But which will focus more on preaching and Sunday worship.
Okay. Oh, that's good too.
But Mark Morrison Reed and I are teaching a class at Meadville next year on rituals. So I think we'll have some initial discussions around this. That who knows where it'll lead.
Certainly, well, fabulous. Thanks for everyone for being here.
This was delightful.
Yeah,
Great stuff.
Good to have you, and for all of you who were listening in or watching. We'll see you next week on The View. Have a great week.
All right. Thanks. Bye.